Well, earlier on in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verses 6 and 7, we saw how Paul spoke to the issue of singleness. And in this part of chapter 7, he's going to expand further on what he said about singleness back then. Notice three benefits that the Apostle Paul lists here as to being single. Here's the first one. Being single frees you from other responsibilities. Being single frees you from other responsibilities. Look from verse 25. It says, "Now concerning the betrothed," or the unmarried, "I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none." As you read those few verses about the Apostle Paul, you might be tempted to think that Paul is very against marriage. Isn't that kind of what it sounds like as you read those verses? For example, at the very end of verse 27, he says, "Do not seek a wife." In verse 28, he says, "Those who marry will have worldly troubles." And you kind of read those verses and you think, wow, Paul is very against marriage. But remember the context to which Paul is writing here. At the very start of verse 26, he says, "I write these things in view of the present distress." The Apostle Paul speaks this way about single people thinking about getting married in view of the present distress. In other words, I'm giving this advice on the basis of what is happening in Corinth right now. And so the automatic question that we ask is this: well, what is happening in Corinth right now? And that's an issue that we are not entirely sure of. There's a lot of scholarly debate as to what might be happening at that time. Perhaps there was a time of intense persecution against God's people. Perhaps there was an economic downturn and so money was tight. Maybe there was a famine in the land. But regardless of what it was, the Apostle Paul's message really is this to those who are single: it might be advantageous to you to remain single. Adding to your family at this point just might pile on the pressure, and so at this present time, it's maybe best for you to remain single, as it will relieve you of some of that pressure. It will free you. Of course, he says here, if you do want to get married, that's fine, you have not sinned. But very practically, perhaps at this point in time, in light of the current distress, it's most advantageous to you to remain single. But the second benefit that the Apostle Paul outlines for us is this: marriage is temporary anyway. Marriage is temporary anyway. Look at verse 31. "And those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away." The Apostle Paul reminds us that marriage is in fact temporary. And it's a covenant which exists while we are here on earth. You might remember that we saw this a couple of days ago when we asked the question, what does it take to break the marriage covenant? And one of the answers the Apostle Paul gives us was this: the death of your spouse. When death comes, the marriage covenant ends, because marriage is an earthly covenant. We say, "Till death do us part." And so in heaven there will be no marriage, Jesus taught. And for those of you who are perhaps married, that might be a disturbing thought. Why is there no marriage in heaven? Well, the answer is the very purpose of marriage when we're in heaven ceases to exist. Because what is God's purpose for marriage? It's effectively a big arrow, isn't it? Pointing us to the ultimate marriage between Jesus Christ and his bride, the church. And in heaven, that's exactly what happens. The church and Jesus Christ become one in an ultimate, consummate sense. And so the purpose of earthly marriage, the arrow pointing to the ultimate marriage, is no longer required. It's no longer necessary. The reality, the ultimate expression of marriage is ultimately here. It's kind of like when a big new game is maybe released on the Xbox or the PlayStation. Maybe a couple of months before the game is released, there's a preview version. And the preview version is released earlier, and it's more limited in what it can do, but it's still great. But once the game ultimately is released in its fullness, the previewed version is no longer required. That's kind of what the Apostle Paul says about marriage. Marriage here on earth is like the preview to the ultimate marriage between Jesus and his church. And so why are there benefits to being single? Well, firstly, it frees you from certain responsibilities. Secondly, marriage is temporary anyway. And then thirdly, notice that it allows for undivided devotion. Look with me from verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. We saw this a couple of days ago, looking at singleness, but for those who are single, they have the flexibility which grants them the ability to avail themselves of particular areas of gospel service that those who aren't single are unable to avail themselves of. And so Paul says that is one of the benefits of being single. But in spite of all these benefits of being single, the Apostle Paul still clarifies marriage is good. And so if you want to be married, it's a good thing. Look at verse 36 to 38. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is not a sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has discerned this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage does even better. Paul says singleness is good and marriage is good. But for those in this present situation in Corinth, perhaps singleness is even more advantageous. Here's your challenge for today. As we've read through chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, we've seen Paul speaking to a multiple number of different categories of people. Those who are married, those who are single, those who are maybe struggling in their marriage, those who are widowed, those who are married to someone whose spouse is not a Christian. We all find ourselves in one of those categories. As you identify which category you fall into, how does the Apostle Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 most challenge you? Hope you have a great day.